Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this week's Tips and Tricks webinar. Today's topic is the 2020 threat recap. And of course, we'll talk about what's happened in 2021 also. So please use the Q&A chat in this Zoom session if you have any questions, and we'll make sure we answer those during the webinar. With that, we'll get started. Our presenter today is our Head of Incident Response, Dan Wiley. Dan, take it away.
Woo! No giant applause, no giant like intro music. You know,
Everybody else
when you go to these,
clap for you. Okay.
yeah, there you go. That's awesome. Right. Thank you so much. Yeah. So during these CPXs, you know, they play these big emotional music to get you pumped up. And I miss that, right? Like during CPXs here, it's like, where's my big intro? No big intro. Anyway, thank you anyway. Thanks everyone for joining. So I'd like to start with a couple things. For the folks that know me, so I run the incident response team. I also run our advanced services stuff, and I have this weird title called Chief Security Advisor. It basically means that all I do is eat, breathe, and deal with security incidents all day long. So I would like to start with one thing. We've seen, as you probably have heard in the news, a complete crazy number of attacks against Exchange servers over the last 2 weeks. I cannot stress enough how important it is right now that if you have an Exchange server, if it is on the internet and you have not patched it, that you must stop everything you're doing and update that Exchange server. Take that operational hit, but you must do these things. Why? Well, let me explain why. We've seen now 6 different nation state actors use the vulnerabilities that were announced last beginning of this week, end of last week, to basically steal all of your email without anyone ever noticing. It's a 0-day, 0 auth. There's basically only one indicator to see what data has been exfilled, and that's essentially how much data is left. There are ways to detect it, and there's ways to manage, you know, some of this. But at the end of the day, the best thing you could do is update. The sooner, the better. What worries us most is we're starting to see additional threat actors use that vulnerability. So not just, you know, Chinese, Russian, Iranian, North Korean nation state actors, but we're also seeing now ransomware teams starting to use that as a delivery mechanism for ransomware. So in a very short order, we went from only nation state actors kind of stealing this information to commodity ransomware folks. So please, I implore you, you don't want to talk to me. I mean, as much as you love hearing my voice, you really don't want to talk to me and my team when it comes to having a ransomware event inside of your Exchange server. It's not a fun day. So please, you know, take that extra cycle and make sure you're running the right version, make sure you're updating, make sure you have some security controls around it, make sure you have the IPS signatures updated on the front end gateways in front of your Exchange servers. If you can, turn off OA or put it behind a VPN. Don't expose your Exchange server directly to the internet, please, 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 because that's 90% of the problem. If you had some sort of protection in front of it, you weren't impacted by this threat. But if you were just sitting out there with your OA port exposed, you're pretty much hosed. We anticipate around 100,000 victims, and that list is just growing significantly. So just be aware that this attack is here today. It's pretty darn bad. I would classify this a 10 out of 10 from criticality, and please spend those extra cycles to update. On top of that, of course, that's not the only thing we're tracking. There was a couple other vulnerabilities over the last few weeks that are also pretty nasty. There's an F5 vulnerability that was released yesterday or the day before. Can't keep track of which day it was. That F5 vulnerability is also pretty nasty. Make sure you update your F5. There's also a VMware vulnerability that's out there. Please update that also. And you get the point here. Just make sure you've got that update cycle for those patches for all of your critical systems. And it's almost going to be a full-time job just to maintain and update all of that stuff. Lastly, in 2021, I wouldn't say ransomware is on a decline. It's just sort of plateaued. We're seeing a lot of ransomware attacks still. It's not changing. You know, we're still seeing them. It's just not spiked as much as it did in 2020. I think a lot of that's because of some of the infrastructure that was recently taken down by both the Emitet infrastructure and some of the TrickBot infrastructure. But it's just a temporary lull. It'll pick up again. No question about it. In 2020, you know, I think, you know, we did a tips and tricks in 2020, and nothing really changed from that last conversation, except for SolarWinds, which I'll spend just a few minutes talking about. But just to recap for 2020, business email compromise, still a big deal, not going anywhere. You know, O365 is a sweet, fat, juicy target. People are going after it. So remember, you know, is business email compromise is still a significant threat vector. Definitely consider your multi-factor strategy for authentication. I will say that we're seeing more and more actors interrupting and attacking both any factor that's SMS based or email based. So you may want to start thinking about hard tokens or biometric authentication for your multi-factor and get away from using email or SMS as a factor. I also think, you know, some of the applications that provide authentication, like, you know, Google Auth or Microsoft Authenticator or any of the authenticators, they're good. But I'm really leaning towards hardware these days. A second factor that's outside of the realm of any of the applications that you're running, and literally something you have to touch to get things moving on the authentication front. So start thinking about that. The other thing, you know, ransomware was still a big deal in 2020. A significant number of attacks against a significant number of victims. We're going to be releasing a report here pretty soon with all the core statistics, but right around 40% of all of our incidents, maybe even 50%, were centered around ransomware in 2020. The impact was massive. There's no way around saying, you know, it caused an incredible amount of damage across a lot of victims. We did see a lot of the ransomware targeting remote access as the initial entry point, specifically RDP, specifically any of the VPN technologies, you know, Pulse Secure, Cisco VPN, Palo Alto, Fortinet. They were all targeted very aggressively in 2020. I would say that that trend will not stop. It will continue. You know, everyone's going to continue to probe for those vulnerabilities, those entry points to break in. We also saw, you know, a significant number of phishing attempts for credentials. Credentials were highly sought after, especially fresh, good, known RDP creds, for example. We saw a lot of actors selling and phishing and creating a marketplace just for RDP credentials. So be aware that any of your remote access points of entry are very juicy for the attackers. Now, one thing we saw that was very uncommon in 2020, and is sort of like a lead up to the SolarWinds conversation, is, and this is really no different than the last few years, but it really kind of came home to roost, is AD is primarily the only method of lateral movement that we saw attackers use in 2020. It's extremely rare to see attackers using SSH or some other method to move laterally in these environments. We mostly saw Active Directory lateral movement. So we started keeping track of some interesting information around it. We reviewed all of our case notes in 2020, and there was a couple common themes. Everyone's AD was screwed. Everyone. Not a single customer had sort of a pristine AD. It doesn't exist. It's unicorns and you know, pot of golds at the end of the rainbow. Nobody can, in our opinion, actually secure AD. I think it's an impossibility. Or it's so costly to do it that no one can do it. So that got us thinking, and I'm starting to take a much harder position around this, and that is, I really am encouraging all of our customers to consider moving away from it. I mean, it's like asking you to give up water, if you will. You kind of need water to survive, and I understand that AD is such a critical component to your infrastructure that you can't like wake up one morning and to say, I'm getting rid of AD, but it's the single common source in all of these attacks. I mean, if you try to defend yourself and put in layer upon layer of layer of additional security controls, and even when you put in additional security controls specifically around AD, I don't think you actually have a chance to actually defend against AD lateral movements attacks. And let me explain why I have this opinion now. In 2020, when we started seeing the SolarWinds thing really starting to explode, one of the victims was Microsoft. And they fell victim to a lateral movement privilege escalation attack within their own Active Directory. I am not convinced anyone actually has the tool sets or the capabilities to defend it at the level that they need to with the permissions that it actually grants you, right? So AD literally is there to make it easier to discover services, printers, computers, users, services. It's designed to make it easy for someone to go from A to B to C to D to E. The problem with that is that is diametrically opposed to what zero trust is about. And that contention is causing this massive rift, this disturbance in the force that I don't think you can actually fix with the legacy infrastructure. I don't think it's an impossibility. Let me explain why. So the SolarWinds attack, I think is quite novel, not necessarily because the attacker was able to break in and modify source code. That's happened multiple times. I mean, we've got 50, 60 examples of that. But what was really interesting was what the attacker did once they were inside of customers' networks. And there's not a lot of press around this because I think so many people are so concentrated on the supply chain angle that they're missing a bigger point, which is when the attacker got into customers' environments, we handled 15, 20 SolarWinds breaches globally, and there were some common themes. Number one, there was no evidence of lateral movement in any of the customers. It just wasn't there. And let me repeat that. There was no signs of lateral movement within customers' networks when the attacker was inside of AD. Even with CrowdStrike, Carbon Black, all of the additional Sysmon tools that were actually deployed, there was no evidence of that lateral movement, but yet we knew the attacker was in the network because we knew that they touched other components of the network. We got some hints, we got some signs, but we didn't get that red glaring sign that says, hey, this is lateral movement. We saw things like, hey, I dumped the logs out of the server, be gaps in logs, for example, or there might be one little stray PowerShell command that looks just like an administrative activity, and you would have totally missed it if you didn't connect the dots with timing and gaps in logs. And maybe if you got really super lucky, you might have seen a little higher command being executed, but you only saw it at the server endpoints. You never saw it within AD or within the logs within the domain controllers. So that's kind of scary, right? Because some of these victims had all of the tools, they had all the telemetry, they had all the capabilities, but they were completely blind to the fact that the attacker was actually moving laterally. That's number one. Number two, the attacker also maintained a foothold in a very novel way. And again, this was sort of a nation state sort of capability, but realizing the deficiencies within the Microsoft ecosystem. And they targeted ADFS. ADFS, for the folks that you don't know, is basically just a proxy, if you will, or a connector between your legacy AD and authenticating with cloud apps. And we saw the attacker specifically target ADFS because ADFS is used to create SAML tokens. The attacker would look for the root SAML assertion token, he would steal it and then create his own tokens that basically give him much greater access to additional cloud services. The primarily focused attack vector or victim in that chain was Office 365. They were looking for ways to create persistence to be able to steal email. Well, guess what, guys? We got the exact same thing going on right now with Exchange, right? We're seeing the exact same desire to have a quiet method of stealing emails at scale without anyone noticing. That's a TTP if I've ever seen one, right? That's like, wow, they're trying to create that hidden key that no one pays attention to. And the challenge here again for the forensics guys, for the first 3 weeks, it took us a week and a half to come up with a process to be able to deconstruct the largest spaghetti pile I've ever seen in my life, and that is ADFS authentication logs and logs within the applications themselves to see who's using tokens, how they're using tokens, how they're created, who has access from where, are they logging in from a different IP address than a normal user would? Is there anything about the keys that are interesting? How do we know that a key was created and where is it being used? That was almost impossible. It took us, like I said, 2 to 3 weeks working with Microsoft directly to unravel that spaghetti mess. We saw many, many victims have persistence for over 6 months that were stealing emails for 6 months. Microsoft didn't notice, the customer didn't notice, no one noticed that all of those emails were heading out the door. And with the Exchange vulnerability, we've got something very similar. We've got 2 to 3 months of nobody knowing that this was going on, maybe even longer, of folks sucking out those emails and no one even knowing. So it worries us that, especially if you chain the entire SolarWinds sort of breach together, there are some big concerns here. You know, big concern was, yep, we trusted a vendor and they screwed. They just made really bad security decisions. They didn't have good hygiene. That was bad. The next bad thing was we didn't have the visibility or control within AD to be able to see or stop or even contain lateral. And then lastly, we had no way to see, contain, or manage any of the threats within the cloud infrastructure. What I'm worried about is when you try to connect this legacy crap with the new cloud crap, you end with a much larger crap pile. I don't know how else to put this, because you just don't have the connection points or the capabilities to really visualize or put in the controls to be able to identify and remediate any of these threats. I don't know if you guys remember, at least, it's got to be at least 10 years ago, Google made a decision to dump Microsoft out of their infrastructure and basically get rid of Active Directory and anything Windows inside of Google. And a lot of people kind of poo-pooed that. And most corporations couldn't really do anything about it because, you know, everything was sort of built on this, you know, 30 years of debt, and there was no way on earth they're ever going to move away from these things. But Google did, and you don't see, you know, Google having massive vulnerabilities around, AD or Microsoft. But I will leave you with this thought, which is, I do think there's a moment here to sort of get ahead of the game. We're seeing a lot of transitions to even Azure AD. So if you get rid of your legacy AD and use Azure AD, it has some benefit to doing these things. There's also benefit to start thinking about your entire authentication model in a different way. I know it's not something you're going to do overnight, but start thinking about a bigger game plan about getting off of Active Directory and into a different federated authentication model. I think the crux of my problem with all of this is that if Active Directory was just authentication, I think it would be okay. But AD is so much more than that. that it's just way too big of a monster to connect to cloud infrastructure, because you have this inherent trust of the legacy with the new approach of zero trust. And these two things are just so diametrically opposed. So start thinking about how to get across to your management that maybe things need to change. Maybe we need to change up the game. Maybe we need to do a crazy Ivan on us instead of Ivan doing a crazy thing on us, right? Maybe start doing things a little bit differently and having a different game plan around, especially authentication, authorization, and accounting. Those three things in zero trust are massively important. And making sure that you've got a new approach to it is something to think about, especially if you're starting to create new business paradigms within your business, right? You know, we're seeing businesses starting to do app only kind of employee relations, right? Or employee interfaces. And I'm not saying every company is going to have those things, but they're starting to look at doing business differently because it's not scaling the way it needs to right now. So keep that in consideration as you're moving along in this journey. What worries me is that I one of my mantras is, and I'll quote Oprah here, lessons are repeated until they are learned. I don't know how many more times we have to learn the lesson that what we're doing right now isn't working. It just isn't. And we're getting ourselves into more and more and more debt every single day. And we are losing this war. I had a moment in February where I just saw, well, first of all, it snowed here and it was icy in February and it wasn't very pleasant here in Washington, D.C. Plus, we had all the craziness in politics. And we were starting to see this war really ratchet up to a level where I don't think anyone really appreciated how bad it was. Now people are starting to get it, but we have to start doing things differently or we just don't stand a chance. And that's a concern. And I'm trying to get that across to all of the folks that will actually listen to this crazy old man, that I'm not just sounding the bell. I'm literally telling you that if we don't fix this now, we won't have a chance economically to survive against the nations that are attacking us, because we are not as large and we're not as fundamentally focused on fixing these problems as they are. I leave that with you guys because I think we need to do things differently, and it's time to do it. Okay, I'm off my soapbox.
Well, I'll tag that with it's not really a question, but more of a comment ending on what you said there. Comment came in, AD exchange, etc. The organized attacks choose the battlefield and went after the most widely used and easily compromised tools to net the biggest impact. Well done. If we have an industry don't learn from this, the rest is on us.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I really, it's right. I mean, at some point, how many times do you have to get slapped in the face before you move? Right? I think it's time we move.
Absolutely. Let's see. Are you aware of any plans Microsoft may have to address the AD issue? I don't envision anyone embracing getting rid of AD unless there is a replacement. It's both a tech and mental shift, big hurdle to overcome.
Yes, they are. They're trying very hard to re-architect Azure AD to be the replacement for AD. We meet with Ann Johnson a ton, and they can't really parrot everything I said because they can't, how do I say this? Crap in their own house. But what they can do is try to formulate a different approach. So take a look at their new password strategy. It helps, right? It doesn't solve all the problems, but it helps. The other challenge Microsoft has is that they have 30 years of debt that is collected, and even they are trying to push customers away from using Windows 7, but yet we still see it, and we still see XP, and we still see NT, and we still see I don't understand how this machine's still running a 311 box, right? So you know, some of this is on us because we need to sort of evolve with the vendors that we choose to participate with. You don't really have a choice. But at the same time, you also have to push the boundaries and say, I gotta do things differently. And Microsoft is helping. I'm not saying they're not. I'm just saying that we're in the worst of the worst at the moment. This is like, it can't get much worse than these attacks. It really can't. Other than, you know, a massive cloud breach. But hey, I'm hoping that doesn't happen.
Poke the bear. I think you just answered this one. Is using AD Connect better than using standard AD? I think you just said yes, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
going
let me qualify that. I mean, it's hard to do AD Connect, right? It's hard because you've got so much legacy stuff. It's really hard to get everything off of the legacy Exchange environments.
Going back to your first point on the Exchange breach, are there any concerns for users of Office 365 Exchange Online, or is it just self-hosted Exchange servers with OWA enabled?
So for the current vulnerability that's been released, it's only on-prem, on-premise Exchange. But I also call out what I talked about on the SolarWinds side is the attackers are probing the living hell out of O365 to look for that next 0 day inside of O365. So I would prepare yourself for that breach. An O365 0 day, I would prepare yourself.
And how would you prepare yourself?
Well, multiple layers, right? I mean,
Yeah.
geofencing, not allowing everybody to connect, you know, giving yourself multi-factor, turning on logging and all the other components. Get a third-party SaaS solution inside of your O365 environment. I mean, the list of controls are pretty significant. It's not insignificant. You know, spend some time on the SAML assertion logging and making sure you understand the SAML keys and how they're used. You can put controls around this, but you got to look.
Absolutely.
You can't just let Microsoft do it for you. You have to help Microsoft.
We just had I won't call out his name, but he just said, somebody said, we've got checkpoint harmony and multi-factor authentication. So there you go.
Woohoo. Well, there's your product pitch for the session.
There you go. And that I swear that came from a customer, it wasn't me. Okay. All right. I think we pretty much have it covered. Well, thanks again, Dan. I know your time is short. You're very busy with all these breaches, but we do appreciate you jumping on and giving us that information. Again, I'll make a pitch for you. The incident response team, those guys are, you know, always available. And if something unfortunate does happen, please give these guys a call. They are experts. They are vendor agnostic and they can help you out. So thank you again, Dan.
Anytime.
Our next call will be 2 weeks, March 26th. Gus Cornell will be back and he's going to give us some advanced posture management information. This is going to be basically a part 2 to his CPX talk. So I will send that out soon. You'll also get a follow-up email with the recording link of this session and any reference content. But with that, I'll let you get back to your Friday. Dan, thanks again. And everyone, enjoy your day. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.